Well, good morning. We are going to start our day with the New Testament. Always a good way to start your day with 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 12 through 15. Now, it's been a while since we've talked about this, so we'll just kind of, as quickly as we can, try to refresh your memory. There are some people who are um, interfering with Paul's work in Corinth. He calls them at one point, um, uh, there's a funny name. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Chapter 11, verse 5. Indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. So there's some people who are interfering with Paul's work in Corinth. Um, Probably in a number of ways. So the theological problems in Corinth were um, antinomianism, which would be basically saying, since I'm saved by grace, there's no need to live by the Ten Commandments. There's no need to uphold the Ten Commandments because, you know, I have kind of this get out of jail free card, so I approach life that way. So in Corinth, there was obviously problems that would connect to business. Living according to the Ten Commandments. Honoring. The seventh commandment, doing your best to ensure your neighbor's possessions and income. There's lots of different, probably personal interactions, but the primary problem would have been idolatry. We would call that coarse idolatry in Corinth, i.e., literally worshiping other pagan idols. There were, I think, if my memory holds, around like 15 to 17 different temples in Corinth proper, all dedicated to different gods. And of course, the most looming one over Corinth would have been the temple to Aphrodite, which was on top of the Acrocorinth, a hill that sits above Corinth. And it was a known place. There were around 1,000 cultic prostitutes where you would go, and having sex was part of the ritual worship there at the temple of Aphrodite. So we have this, inside the church. Of course, these problems are out in the world in Corinth. What inside the church would be, people are probably still mingling with foreign idols, and possibly even, Paul makes it clear in 1 Corinthians that they're possibly even still uniting their bodies to prostitutes. So participating in worship on at the temple of Aphrodite. So you've got this going on. Maybe the people who are teaching are saying, well, it's okay to do sinful things with your body because we're saved by Christ. So it could be an antinomianism thing. It could be a Gnosticism where they're saying, well, no, there's a Gnosticism hasn't really developed as a thing yet, but there were kind of the beginnings, the first inklings of Gnosticism, which Gnosticism is basically just idea that there's a secret set of rules, of teachings, of information. And once you have them, the secrets, right, then you're truly part of the in circle, then you're maybe even truly saved, all these kind of things. So Paul was very open when he went there. He preached them the gospel and all of its truth and purity. We came to you and sought to preach Jesus Christ crucified, he says in 1 Corinthians. Perhaps these apostles, these super apostles, were teaching some, proto form of Gnosticism, that there was things that Paul didn't teach. There were rules, and of course, we also know already the most prevalent one that we've seen it in the text is that there's still Judaizers in the church. So you have a number of problems, right? Which is true of really any church even today. You're going to have people. A church is a gathering of people, and they're all going to be different. They're all going to have different ideas about things, and they're all going to struggle with different things, right? It's just to be expected. So these Judaizers were people who probably thought that new Christians were supposed to adhere to Jewish traditions, be circumcised, honor the festivals, these maybe even pilgrimage to Jerusalem, all these sorts of things. So whatever the case may be, we're not exactly sure, like exactly. We know that there's a smattering of kind of all of these things being preached. What is Paul referring to? It could be any of these three things, or it could be all of them. Right? Um, anyway, they're coming in and they're teaching things that are contrary to what Paul taught. And it seems as though how Paul has been responding, that they have been questioning his authority as an apostle. Um, Probably due to two reasons they question his authority. Number one, his background, his history. This is a guy who persecuted the church. Can we trust him? Does he have the church's best interest in mind? It's hard to let go of old wounds, right? Um, and then the other thing would be, is his apostleship, i.e., his teaching, so he was given a vision of Jesus on the Damascus Road. Is that equivalent to what the other disciples received in their 3-year ministry with Christ? So there's probably two different ways, and there might be even others. The idea that he is approaching Gentiles, eating with them, not following the cleanliness or the cleanliness rules of the Jews. There could be additional reasons why they're questioning his authority. Okay, so that kind of puts us in our mindset. That's what Paul is responding to. Apparently, that they've been questioning his authority as an apostle. And we lead off then on our section today, starting with verse 12. Okay. So we begin. Hade poio kai poioseo hine ekoposo ten aformen ton thelontan, sorry, aformen hina en o kalkantai hurothsin Gathos kai hemes, kehemes. That's the end of the sentence. So det would be a contrasting particle, right? Like a but or a however. So it would set off verse 12 as a contrast to what came before it. So what, however, I do, poio is a verb for doing. What, however, I do, also I will do, so that I might cut off the opportunity of those desiring an opportunity, that in what they are boasting they might be found as also we. That is really confusing. How's the ESV translated? And what I do, I will continue to do, in order to undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission they work on the same terms as we do. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And what I do, I will continue to do. Well, we refer back to the verse before to make sense of this. Verse 9. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers came from Macedonia, supplied my need. Right. So he's been in a paragraph or so talking about how he never took from the Corinthians for the service that he did for them. Other people were making his mission work in Corinth possible. Although he had a right to tell them, I want you to support the work I'm doing here, but he never did that, so that he says in verse 10, as the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. So he did these things. Actually, there's one place where he says it better. He basically says, I did this so that you can't look at what I'm doing and say it was for the money, basically, right? Um, if I can find that verse. Yeah, maybe verse 8. I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you, right? Or verse 7, actually. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I preached God's message to you free of charge, right? Well, these apostles apparently are charging something. They're expecting some kind of, which by the way, in all of the pagan temples, that's how this would work. Um, for example, in Ephesus, the temple of Artemis we know this one to be very true, and this is why Paul got run out of town in Ephesus, was that there was a nice little kind of cyclical game going on where the silversmiths would make silver trinkets, silver items. Visitors who, and of course, in the Roman world, you would probably have a god that would be kind of your god, your special god. A lot like kind of how Catholics dealt with saints. Well, you have a saint that is your patron saint. So, not, I don't want to make a connection in terms of theological, just the simple idea is that you probably have one God that you're maybe close to, but you'd worship probably several different gods, or maybe even all of them. But one would be one that. So there was a business, or there was, I should say, a practice that people pilgrimage to Ephesus to see the temple of Artemis, um, and then they would buy silver trinkets and leave silver trinkets, or sometimes they would sacrifice animals at these pagan temples, and then the people would take either the silver and trade it for money, or they'd take the meat and sell it to a meat vendor and trade that for money, or use some of the proceeds of the animal for their own household, right? So, in other words, there's this thing set in place that a priest, pagan at least, gets paid for what they do. And of course, there is also a sense in the Old Testament that priests ought to be, Levitical priests and the high priest ought to be supported out of the offerings to the temple to God, right? So there's both a Hebrew uh, history of that, and as well as it's in the pagan world. So maybe there's even a sense here amongst the people that, if something's free, how good can it be? Right? I mean, there is that sometimes that people kind of assume that anything free is not worth what it's worth, right? um, there could be that, and that could be what the apostles are kind of pointing as, like, well, he gave you this free. What's it really worth? And Paul's saying, well, it wasn't free. The people in Achaia, I'm sorry, the people in Macedonia were bending over backwards to support what I'm doing, so that it could be free to you, right? But by the way, he's also kind of in the midst of gathering up an offering, and he's like, I don't want your money, right? You can be part of it, but I don't want you, because you're so mixed up in theology right now that I think you would be giving to this offering for the wrong reasons, not out of thoughts of charity and love and thankfulness, but probably out of some sense of obligation or duty. So Paul is maybe he's referring to that as well. So he's going to keep doing what he's doing, which is ministering to them free of charge, and also preaching Christ crucified, not holding, as we've established from First Corinthians and the first part of Second Corinthians, not holding any mysteries, being very open with God's truth, and preaching the gospel. Right. So he's just going to keep doing what he's going to do, and that work will eventually undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission they work on the same terms as we do, right? I almost want to, there's the Proverbs, uh, Okay. Yeah. Proverbs 25:22. And then Paul actually quotes it, right? He quotes it in Romans. He says, let's get the whole proverb. Proverb 20. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he is thirsty, give him water to drink, for you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Right? So the answer is not to immediately argue with, fight against, make difference of, but keep doing what you're doing. And in fact, love your neighbor. And eventually it will show very clearly who's right and who's wrong here, right? They're going to keep exacting offerings and they're going to keep talking how they're talking. And Paul's just going to keep doing what he's doing. And it's going to become pretty clear, pretty quick that he's right and they're wrong. Yeah. Okay. Then in their boasted mission, they work on the same terms as we do. I think, the terms would be offering the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? Freely, and in love, Verse 13. Hoigar toi toiotoi. Ooh, that's tough. Pseudo apostoloi, ergatai doloioi. Ooh. Metaschematomenoi es apostolos Christou. Okay. That's a lot of weird, tough words. For such men, for such are, so he's referring, this is referring back to the ones we just talked about, these, the ones that are boasting, right? For these guys, the super apostles, for such false apostles, for these guys are false apostles, deceitful workers, deceitful ones, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. I think going back to verse 12, then, right, this idea that somebody cut off the opportunity of those desiring an opportunity, right? So, in other words, I get the feeling that when he says opportunity, he doesn't necessarily mean that in terms of preaching the gospel. I think he means that in terms of what he's, because he's saying, however, right, and it's a contrast to what he said. Well, we didn't charge you anything, but these men, they're seeking an opportunity. So I have to assume that the opportunity. Let's take a look. Yeah. I mean, there's a note here. Paul will keep on renouncing his rights to, this is verse 12, renouncing his rights to show the intruders as lovers of comfort, addicted to the perks. Um, so, and then they push circumcision in order to establish their false doctrine that the works of the law were necessary for righteousness and salvation. So, Judaizers, definitely. Okay. I think it's probably twofold. They want position and they want comfort, probably in that order, right? They want power, power in this sense to control the terms in which forgiveness is given. Some guys really. I've seen examples in the past, unfortunately, where you see men who get into the pastoral office and they really enjoy the ability to withhold or retain sins. I'm sorry, to retain sins. They enjoy that power to be the one judging, right? Um, I don't think that's, to some extent, it's a complicated thing. Like, when you offer the sacrament as a pastor, you can spend a lot of time analyzing people's motives and wondering if they're truly, number one, agreement with the theology that undergirds the sacrament, right? So, do they believe in LCMS doctrine, or do they adhere to the teachings of the confessions, right? And it's hard to know that sometimes. You can't analyze every person's mind. You should know your people well enough to know they're on the right place. Um, Especially about current topics, the problem of homosexuality in our world, the problem of sexuality in general, the problems of abortion, the problems of government and how it works itself out sometimes. Um, Lots of different ways. It's hard to know exactly, but I think all that you can do, and I'm not advocating, this is not me advocating for like open communion or anything, but you put a very clear and direct communion statement. We expect that you would actually agree with what we teach. We're an LCMS congregation, so it's very easy to look up what we teach, but we believe in the teachings of the Book of Concord, right? With no equivocation, with no kind of some people have things where they'll say like, well, we believe the Book of Concord in so much as it's a book written to 16th century people. No, Book of Concord is binding. It is a norm for us. Um, so you put that document in there. You put that communion statement in there, and then you go through confession and absolution, and you hope that your people are confessing their sins and asking the Lord for forgiveness that you're offering, right? So in terms of confession, there's of course the outward words that we do in corporate confession where we actually speak words. Um, I think a lot of times when I'm going through corporate confession, I'm also thinking about things inside my head that are maybe more personal in nature. Of course, personal confession was probably better done in personal confession, confession absolution with a pastor. Suffice to say, I think at a certain point, you kind of have to take people at their word. Do you know what I mean? Like, if they're going to ask for forgiveness and you as a pastor are going to forgive them, then that's it. But I think sometimes pastors get this idea that they know something, um, and then they have to deal with it, or they think they know something and they have to deal with it. It's like, well, I don't think you confront sin until you're absolutely positive evidence that it exists. Um, in other words, that it's become public, or they've expressed it to you, or they have wrong-headed theology, or the case may be. But I've seen this where pastors will assume they know things, will withhold forgiveness because that thing that they assume that the person's done, now the person won't ask for forgiveness for that thing. And we're at loggerheads here because I'm the one judging whether you've truly repented or not, which is a dangerous place to get, right? So I think sometimes pastors get into the job for the wrong reasons, whether it is a place to, you're looking for comfort, you're looking for a job that pays moderately well, and you don't, your heart's not really in it, or you want to have that power. I think that's what it's getting at here is these false apostles are deceitful because they're in it for the wrong reasons. Yeah. They're not here to make the gospel of Jesus Christ known. It's not their driving, their modus operandi. Rather, they have other kind of deceitful things at hand. So everything kind of, they're going to preach the law and they're going to talk about, tithing and money, but it's a disguise. It's not really obvious that they're. I'm always surprised. I'm not. That's a weird way to say it. I've had people come up to me and say that the sincerity of what I say is more important than actually what I say, which at some point as a writer kind of bothers you, but you also, take it as a compliment that they look at what you're preaching and how you're preaching it, and they get a feeling from you that you actually care, that they learn, that they hear the gospel, that they believe it, that it gives them hope. Like they actually believe that you're there to try to give them hope. and that's reassuring to them, right? Um, so I think it's clear. I think people can kind of tell when you're in it for the right reasons as opposed to the wrong reasons. And it'll become readily apparent. As Paul's saying too, it's kind of we're going to keep doing what we're doing, and your work's going to come readily apparent over time. Verse 15. Umega un e kai hoi de koenoi oto, sorry. Meta schematsonai sontai, sorry. Has diakonoi, diakai, dikaio sines, honto telos estai kata ta erga auton. It is not. Oh, I forgot verse 14. I'm sorry. Kai o thalma autos gar ho satanas metaschematizai es angelon photos. Okay. And no wonder himself or Satan masquerades as an angel of light. Okay, so, and it's not surprising, right? Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. He tries to pretend to be something he isn't. And I already read verse 15, so I'll just go ahead and translate. It is not surprising, therefore, if also the servants of him masquerade as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to the deeds of them. So, it's interesting. So what we've come up against so far is that probably the primary idea here is the primary problem is that these men are probably Judaizers. They're probably teaching that you have to do circumcision and Jewish festival, follow Jewish traditions in order to attain or get salvation and forgiveness. And I think this is why Paul probably talks about these servants being servants of the devil, right? Being servants of him, and it's referring back to Satanas, so it's got to be servants of the devil. For Paul, preaching a opposite of the gospel is akin to being a servant of Satan. I mean, that's strong. It's very strong. And we probably should understand that. What do we? There's a word for it. Justification is there's a word, I can't remember the word we call it, but it's like a female reference in the church. Justification is justification by grace is the most important theology that we have in the church. It absolutely, if you don't get justification by grace right, everything else falls apart. Yeah. And I think that's what's going on here. Is there's a difference between justifying by grace as opposed to justifying by doing the works of the law. And Paul's saying if you're going to do anything apart or different from justifying by grace, then you're anathema. You're a servant of the evil one, right? And I think verse 15 then very quickly refers back to verse 12, right? That they're going to be found out. Paul's going to keep doing what he's doing, preaching justification by grace. But these apostles, it's going to become, now that he's compared that theology to the work of the evil one, it's going to be really easy for them to distinguish it, to see it, to ascertain it, right? Identify it. If they're going to say like, well, you can't have eternal life if you don't become circumcised, or you can't have eternal forgiveness and salvation if you don't honor the new moon festival. Well, it's going to become really clear. These people are teaching a justification apart from grace according to the law. and it should be hopefully really clear. Okay. I think we were going to stop at 15. That is correct. So we will leave off there, and then we get into a new section next time. Paul will talk about his sufferings. So we'll leave that for next time. Why don't we jump backwards then into the Proverbs for a moment? We're looking at Proverbs chapter 10, and we are picking up at verse 27. Now, again, just to remind you, we're in this section of Proverbs where they're just kind of wisdom, pithy sayings. There isn't like when we're talking about folly and pursuit of wisdom, or wisdom personified. There were long stretches where they're all connected and thematically connected. These ones aren't. They're going to be shorter thoughts. Maybe a couple verses will be connected together and kind of, or at least similar. But no, the really kind of dealing verse to verse here. That's there's not a lot of connection. So, starting with verse 27. Yarat Yahweh, Tosip, Yamim, Usanot, Resaim, Tiksorena. So Yarat is Yara is to fear. So the fear of Yahweh. And then Yamim is days. We have this word Tosip. Let's look that one up real quick, which is to add. To add more, to add again, right? Join. Continue, exceed. So we get this. I think add is a good thing here. Prolongs, adds. We probably say like adds on to days or adds days, and we would understand in English is prolong. Yeah. The fear of Yahweh prolongs days, but the years, Rasah, which is wicked, and then the Resaim, is the case and gen or number and gender, so it's masculine and plural, right? So, but the years of the wicked will be shortened. So, almost opposite word from tosip, to be short. Let's see here. Cut down. Harvest men. That's interesting. Curtail. To harvest grain. That's so cut down or probably in this it's a cut down idea, but in contrast to the prolonged, we would like understand this cut down meaning to be cut short or to be shortened, right? It's not too hard to put this into real life. Yeah. Indulgence of any kind, whether it's food, alcohol, drugs, sex, maybe even like possessions, hoarding. All these things in very real ways can shorten one's life. Sexual diseases, the ravages of alcoholism and using drugs, and typical ways of even greed to a certain extent. Because I think, well, maybe not. You could see ways in which greed could lead to increased stress or bad ways of thinking or feeling. But living the fear of Yahweh would be trusting in God, knowing that He will provide, not having anxiety or stress about your tomorrows because God numbers them and He knows them, right? So there's a lot of ways in which your life is better. And I think this is actually backed up in statistics that I have to find it. I've seen it somewhere before, but I do know that usually people of faith do have longer lives in the aggregate in general. Of course, there will be outliers, but in general, and also I think I've also read that people who are married usually live longer in the aggregate, as well as people who are people of faith and married usually have they feel more fulfillment or joy in their lives than the opposite. Again, this is in the aggregate. There are outliers, of course. Um, the point being is, I think the statistics would actually bear this wisdom out. But I think we can look at it and just understand it too. It makes sense. And then we're not even talking about the theological implications as well, right? Uh, what if what if the days here? What if we're talking about, you know, are we talking about eternity? The fear of Yahweh leads to eternity, to eternal life. Um, Now, it probably doesn't work perfectly because we know that suffering will also be eternal, but it's a thought. Verse 28. Tolahet, no, I'm sorry, Tohalet, Tohalet, Sadikim, Simha, Vetikvat, Resaim, Tobed. We've had this word before, Tohalet, uh, so it's a version of uh, Tokaleth, which is just hope expectation. Okay, so the hope Zedekim, we've had that one before a lot. Um, the hope of the righteous. How did it organize that? Let's take a look at this. The hope of the righteous, okay, brings joy, brings gladness, simcha. Is that simcha? It is. Simcha, which is joy. That's one of the reasons why we named our daughter Joy, because simcha is a biblical word. It's a biblical thought, right? So joy. Um, so the hope of the righteous brings joy, but the expectation of the wicked will perish. The righteous brings joy, but the expectation of the wicked will perish. That's strange. It's strange in terms of the word of expectation. Okay, that makes sense then. So there's a note here. Aspirations of the wicked, by contrast, amount to little more than wishful thinking. So in other words, like there are lots of people like planners, right? They plan out their life and they've got all these like grand ideas. We're gonna get the house and the lake and the cabin and the cars and the things. And life really turns out like that. Or maybe you work so hard that you get all those things and you turn around and you're too old to enjoy them, right? Or life's passed you by, or maybe your kids don't talk to you, or whatever the case may be. These things don't really. And it's interesting that in verse 28, the righteous, it, you know, what will be the joy of the righteous? It's not their earthly lives, 28, right? It's not the trappings of earthly life. It's not all the stuff. It's not all the things, right? It's their hope. And their hope is what? Their hope is forgiveness. Their hope is eternal life with their God. Their hope is a new heavens and new earth, a perfect Eden, right? That they were thrown out of and now they'll go back into. So that's their hope. So it doesn't say that their life is going to be great or perfect or fine, but they have hope that they will have salvation and eternal life. How far do we say we're going today? 32. A couple more verses here then. Ma'ot slatom derek Yahweh umed hita lepo ale avem. Ma'ot latom. Strength is for the upright, the way of Yahweh. Hmm. I wonder if it's actually supposed to be the way of Yahweh for the upright is strength. Okay, so they really mixed it up. I'm trying to figure out how they got the word order because I'm not seeing any subjective versus nominative versus genitive here. Okay. So you could say it maybe roughly. This would be how the Hebrew actually says strength for the upright is the way of Yahweh. Right? But then in English we would say, in a more the way of the Lord, the way of Yahweh is strength, strong. They said stronghold. It's well, I mean we can look it up. Oh, it's a place or means of safety. Okay. Well, yeah, that would be a stronghold then. Oh, that makes sense. The way of Yahweh is for the upright a stronghold. That'd probably be a better way of translating it. But destruction comes or will come to the workers of iniquity. Oh, okay. Hmm. So the way of Yahweh, I think, is right in the center of this verse, and it becomes the pivot point or the hinge for both ends of the proverb, right? So strength for the upright is the way of Yahweh, but destruction to the workers of iniquity, the way of Yahweh, right? So, in other words, the way of Yahweh, it's kind of like the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the meek. If you're meek, this is gospel. If you're not meek, it's law. So, the way of Yahweh, which is righteousness, is right in the center. And for upright people, righteousness is good, but for in workers of iniquity, the justice of Yahweh is bad because He will punish. Um, verse 30. Yeah. Okay. Verse 30. Um, Zadik le'olam bal yamot uresaim lo yiskenu aretz. Aretz. Okay. So Zadik, we know that one. That's righteous. The righteous le'olam shall never ball. That's weird. You get two nevers on there. I wonder why that is. Long duration. Oh, okay. So the word is olam, which is a long duration, and then the lamed in the beginning is a um, prefix that makes it negative. Then we have ball on top of it, which means not, never. So it almost feels like this word that it's like accentuating the thing, right? Um, I think in English you'd almost say, "The righteous shall never ever be removed." I'm curious how the ESV brought it up here, verse 30. The righteous will never. Okay, they just went with the. It's basically giving us two separate words to accentuate the idea of never. Um, what's an example of this? So sometimes, well, like Hebrew will drop in like Yahweh Adonai, which means literally God, God. But there's another place where basically, oh, this is gonna drive me nuts. Where it's basically kind of like using accentuating things to say behold, right, to really get your attention. I think that's probably what's going on here. So the righteous shall never ever be removed, but the wicked will not inherit the earth. Will not inhabit the earth. So I think this is probably talking about. This has got to be talking about, you know, eternal life and final judgment, right? Verse 31 then. P Zadik Yanub Hakma Ulason Tapukot Tikra Tikkaret. Let's do 32 too, just to be done. Sibte Sadik Yedaun Rasaon Upi Resaim Tapukot. So P is mouth. So the mouth of Zadik, righteous, right? Brings forth Chokmah. We've had that one before too. Is wisdom, right? So the mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, but the tongue, ula son, the tongue. We've had this one before too. Tapu kot, the perverse. We've had that one before. Will be cut out. So the mouth of the righteous speaks wisdom, but the tongue of the perverse will be cut out. So um, that would be like in a primitive way or an Old Testament way. The quickest way to stop someone from speaking is to take their tongue, right? To make them mute. And then continuing on here, the lips of the righteous know what is acceptable, but the mouth of the wicked is perverse. Um, that's pretty straightforward. I don't know. Yeah, we should probably say too that I don't know if this is necessarily verse 31 insinuating that we'd actually cut out violently someone's tongue, but just that their tongue would be ceased, right? That they wouldn't be allowed to continue to speak perverse things. Yeah. You know, I've seen this a lot here. This verse 32, so I'll just close with an anecdote. Um, I go to like weddings or, you know, in certain situations, I'll be in a place, and the place where it's the worst is in a bar setting or like at a wedding when there's drinks being served. People will be drinking, and then they'll want to, you know, because for whatever reason, whenever people get tipsy or get drunk, they become philosophers and scholars and theologians, and they see the caller and they'll want to debate. Or sometimes they'll innocently want to have questions answered. You do your best to answer those questions, but a lot of times they see the caller and they want to pick a bone. And I'm amazed when I'm out in public and talking to people how how poorly the language can be and also perverse. Like how talk about sexual things or innuendo can happen, uh, and they don't know me, right? All they know about me is I'm a pastor. Why they think it would? I'm just surprised what has become considered appropriate language in the public sphere in our country, right? It's just um, it seems like nothing's off topic. So there you have it. the end of chapter 10 in the Proverbs. I hope you had a good day today. Thank you for being with us in Bible study. If you're watching this later, I hope you enjoy it then. God's blessings, and I hope you have a wonderful Monday.